Hey friends, welcome back to another video. If you saw my latest documentary, My Life at 19, then you would have seen this shot here. Now this shot actually uses a pretty cool technique. It's sort of trippy, it's a bit of a time blending technique. And so what I thought I would do is break down how I created that effect, and we're going to make this shot here. I'm going to bring you along and show you how you can make it for yourself so you can use it in your own videos. Now there are some differences between that shot that I just showed you and the one from my film, namely that this shot incorporates movement. So in the film, my camera is actually on a tripod, it's still, but in this one, I'm actually using a bit of a motion control rig to control the movement of my camera so I can do multiple passes that are the exact same. So let's start by breaking down what is actually going on in this effect. This is a bit of a dual time effect where your foreground is moving at a different speed to your background. So what you're going to need is a foreground shot that is in real time. So that can be 24 frames a second where your subject is moving in real time as your eye would see it. You're also going to need a shot of a time lapse, which is essentially just time sped up. So it's a longer period of time and it's sped up to fit inside the shorter duration of the shot. So you're going to need the time-lapse background and the real-time foreground. And the way I suggest you do that is by making sure that you don't move your camera between the two shots. Or you can do what I'm doing and use a motion control rig, where you can essentially get the same camera movement exactly the same 2 times, so it's repeatable. Creating a motion control setup with the DJI RS2 is actually quite simple. I'm going to select track from the creative shooting menu, and then I'm going to position the gimbal where I want my A point to be. This is where it's going to start from. And when I've positioned it correctly, I'm going to hit the plus icon to create a new waypoint. Now I'm going to simply move the joystick or the gimbal, however you want, into where I want it to end. This is going to be my B point, and I'm going to hit the plus button again to create a new endpoint. Now at this point, what I'm going to do is make sure that the movement duration is set to however long I want it to take for the camera to go between the A point and the B point. In this case, I'm going to choose 10 seconds. Now it's going to take 10 seconds to go from point A to point B. And all I'm simply doing is timing my walk so that I'm walking through the shot as desired. So at this point, you're going to want to make sure that you take note of your settings on the camera so that you can replicate them exactly for the time lapse. So you want to make sure that you note the white balance, the camera focal length. You want to lock off the focus as well. Switch that over to manual focus so it doesn't move and it stays the same. And then when you're moving over to photo mode to take your time lapse, try and match the camera settings like the depth of field and the ISO as best as you can. You're also going to want to make sure that you keep any filters that you used on the video for the track shot in for the photos in the time lapse as well. That way you get a consistent look. It's all about marrying the 2 shots together so that they look like they could be inside of the same shot. It's also important to make sure that your tripod or your gimbal doesn't move. That way it stays in the same location and any movement that it does will always be consistent. If it moves, you'll need to start all over again. When it comes to the time lapse, to mimic this, it's the same process. I'm going to choose time lapse from the creative menu. I'm going to have to start off by setting my time lapse settings. And what I'm really looking for is that clip length marker. I want that clip length marker to be the same duration as the movement duration from the track. That way it goes over the same time period. In this case, it was 10 seconds. So I'm going to make sure my frame rate is the same as the video that I was shooting in this case 24 frames a second. And then I'm going to use the duration and the interval. I'm going to change those parameters up until I get a clip length of 10 seconds. You can do that in multiple different ways, so I like to mess around with the parameters. In this case, I went for a longer duration and a shorter interval. Once I've got that done, I can then move on and set the waypoints for the time lapse so that it can match my track shot. Position the gimbal in the same place as when it started in the track. And you'll be able to see that because you've got a horizontal and a vertical measurement there. You can make sure those numbers align and it will be in the exact same position. I will then press the plus icon to set the A point for the time lapse. I'm then going to do the same thing with the B point, moving the gimbal to where the B point of the track was, and then hitting the plus icon to set a new waypoint. All right, so once you've got your 2 shots, that's everything you're going to need. Now we can jump into some editing, so I'm going to meet you back in the studio, and I'll talk you through how to do the editing process. Welcome back to the studio. Let's get to editing. So I've got my selected shot inside of Premiere and I've already gone ahead and color graded. First thing I'm going to do, number 1 on the list, is to export a frame of the clip to use as a reference image so that when I'm editing the photos, I can match them as closely as possible to the actual footage. To do that, pause the clip at your desired reference frame and hit the export frame button. It's that little camera looking icon in the program monitor. And if you can't see that, you can just go ahead and click on that plus icon on the right-hand side and then look for the export frame icon and then click and drag that into the program monitor toolbar. What this is going to do is save the selected frame as a still image that Lightroom can read. I'm going to name the image and then click on the Browse button to select a folder for the image to be saved in, and then I'm going to click OK. Now we can go ahead and open up Lightroom. I've already got my raw time-lapse images imported as well as my reference still. So I'm going to go to the Develop workspace and click the little reference view icon on the bottom left. This allows me to choose an image as a reference image, so I'm going to scroll along to the still that I had exported from Premiere and then drag it into the reference view. So now I can see the reference still next to the photo that I'm going to edit. And it's important to choose the photo that you're going to edit from a place that's sort of similar to where that reference still comes from in the gimbal's position movement. For example, I know that I pulled the reference still from roughly the middle of the gimbal move, so I should be using my base edit photo from somewhere in the middle of the collection, which is going to roughly line up with the same sort of positioning as where the gimbal would have been. So the goal now is just to edit the photo to match as closely as possible with the reference, looking at exposure levels and color tones and sharpness. So I'm just going to edit the photos until I'm happy with the images and how closely they match. An especially important setting is the lens corrections. Make sure you don't use them because we actually want to retain the lens distortion so it will match the distortion of the video. Once I'm happy, I'll select all the images in the library and then click the Sync button. I'll select the Check All button to make sure it's an exact copy, and then I'll click Synchronize. In the paste settings that appear, choose Replace. This process is going to copy all of the edits from my selected image across all the other selected images in the library. So your library and all the photos inside it will look the same. Now we wait for the edits to sync. Could take a while. Once they're done, go ahead and export all of the images into a folder on your computer, making sure to leave the image name the same so that the order they're in remains consistent. Again, this could take a while. There's a lot of waiting in visual effects. But once it's done, finally, we're going to go back to Premiere and then go up to File, Import, and then locate the folder you saved your edited time-lapse images in. Select the first image and make sure the image sequence box is checked. On a Mac, that little image sequence box is actually hiding in the options window, so you'll have to twiddle that down and select it from in there. Then click Import. This will import the photos as a single clip, using each photo as a frame of video. At this point, you have to do a little bit of guesswork lining up the two clips in time. I like to find where the footage clip stops moving and then position the end of the time-lapse clip at that point. Then I can just trim away the excess on the other side of the footage. I also like to render out the time-lapse footage because I find that it plays back smoother, and it's also easier to import into After Effects. I'll right-click the time-lapse footage, select Render and Replace, and then click OK, and then OK again. Now we wait, again, for the render. Now I want to bring my footage into After Effects for compositing. So I'll right-click on the footage and select Replace with After Effects Composition. We'll wait for After Effects to open up, and then we'll save the project. If you go to the Finder, or the File Explorer if you're on a Windows, and navigate to where the time-lapse images were saved, you should see a new .mxf file. This is your rendered time-lapse. So click and drag it into the project, and then click and drag it into the timeline under the footage layer. So my goal now is essentially to cut out the foreground of the footage layer so we can reveal the time-lapse in the background behind it. Now there are a couple of ways you could do this. I'm going to show you how to use a luma keying method. That works really well for that high contrast shot, but if your shot's more evenly lit, you might have to try a technique called rotoscoping. I'll leave a link to a video up here explaining how to do that. So the objective of luma keying is basically to create a black and white version of your footage where the white parts will reveal the lower layers and the black parts will obstruct them. So in this case, we want our sky to be white and our foreground to be black. To do this, I'm going to start with a levels effect. I'm going to drag the input white down as much as I can before I start losing foreground elements, and then I'm going to raise the input black as much as I can before I start affecting the background elements. Then I'll adjust the gamma to get the most pleasing contrast with the background as bright as possible and the foreground as dark as possible. Then I'll add a tint effect to colorize the image to black and white only, and then I'll add a curves effect. So I'm going to drag the lowest point across as much as I can before the background starts turning black. Then I'm going to drag the highest white point across as much as I can until it becomes a straight line down next to the black point. You might have to play around with where this line falls on your curves graph. The aim is to have the foreground as black as possible whilst the sky remains white. Now I'm going to duplicate the layer and delete all the effects on the lower layer. I'm going to set the track matte to Luma Inverted. This will use the Luma channel of the matte we just made on the footage above as a mask for the footage below. So now I can see the time-lapse layer below the foreground. I'm going to play around with the scale and the positioning of the time-lapse footage to get it to match the real-time foreground. Once they're matched pretty closely, I'm going to pre-compose the matte layer, making sure to move all attributes. This allows me to make changes to the matte layer and refine it more, because as you can see, there are some holes in it. I'm going to duplicate the footage and change the curves effect positioning because I noticed that the clouds on the right-hand side were still in the matte. So I created a mask on the new footage layer so that the changes only affect the cloud area, and then changed the curves so that the clouds were gone and only the land remained. I then had to animate the mask path of that mask so that it stayed over the cloud area for the duration of the footage because the camera's going to be moving. I also created a black solid and masked areas of it over the grass, water, background land, and the boats. I also made sure to animate the mask path of these masks too because they are going to be moving throughout the shot as the camera moves. So what I'm trying to do here is clean up areas of my matte that are going to ruin the effect. So the clouds are going to ruin the effect because they're going to obstruct that time lapse, and it's going to really ruin the effect of dual time when we see real-time clouds and a horrible composite with the sky behind it. And those little holes in the foreground area, they're going to show the sky behind it as well, which is not at all realistic, and it's definitely going to give away that we're just using a mask. So the black solid is there to fix that. So if I go back to my main composition, I can see how the matte refinements look. Much better. I also noticed that the mast of the ship in the time-lapse footage shows above the horizon and dances around really weirdly. So I used a content-aware fill to remove that, and it did a really good job considering how complex the cloud movements are. Looking at the final clip, I think it looks pretty good. There's still some holes in the background layer where the sky shows through, but they're pretty far into the background, and I doubt anyone would pay too much attention to them if they were just to see this shot in a sequence. If Hollywood was to use this effect, they would probably spend a lot more time fixing up that mask, getting rid of all the holes, and then just aligning the timing of the camera moves between the time-lapse and the footage a bit more than I did. But I am still mightily impressed with the results. If you had told me a couple years ago that I could use motion control with just a gimbal and some editing software at home, I would not have believed you. This is insanely cool, and there's so many possibilities that you could use this technique for. So have a think about how you can use it creatively. Maybe there's an element that's in slow motion whilst everything else is in real time. Like, get creative with it. And yeah, I hope this video was able to provide you with some value and some inspiration for your own shots with this technique. So thanks so much for watching. If you have any questions or you want me to clarify anything, let me know in the comments down below. I'll do my best to help you out. But whilst you're down there, like the video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Make sure you hit the notification bell. 2022 has so much coming and you don't want to miss out. If you want to see the documentary where I use this effect, I'm going to go ahead and leave that in the end cards of this video and in the description down below. So give that a watch, check it out, and you can see another example of this effect being used in an actual film. Thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you next week, Wednesday. See you then.